Hi, welcome to the Online Jewelry Academy. I'm Professor John Ahr and I'm your instructor. Now, how many times have you said, I am dying for a necklace that I could put a flower into? Well, probably never, but it's kind of cute. And this is a great project that's going to teach you tons of techniques, and who knows, maybe you'll love making them and giving them as gifts. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to make hammered hollow forms using a die system. Now, it's really easy, and I know that sounds overwhelming, but it's really easy, so stick with me. This project requires a minimum number of tools. You're just going to need some graph paper, a glue stick, something that you can push metal with. Here I've got a center punch, a ball-peen hammer, either masonite or MDF, that's medium density fiberboard. It's just glorified glued sawdust, and some copper. Now, the copper I'm using is a 24 gauge sheet. You could go as thick as maybe 20 gauge, but believe me, the thinner the better, because if it's thin, it's easier to manipulate. All right, so let me show you what to do. The first thing that you want to do is you want to come up with a design. And I've got two designs right here. Now, this one you probably recognize from the piece that's already standing up on the bench, but I want to talk about the differences between the two. This one obviously is very curvaceous and has no corners. This one, very straight in terms of the edges, and it has tons of corners. Not so good. This one is doable, but this one is really doable. And the other thing that you have to remember is when you design these pieces, think ahead. And what I would say is, you never know. You could cut that in half and you'd end up with a really interesting shape. Or you might cut it in half this way and have an interesting shape. Maybe instead of flowers, you put a little succulent plant in it. Sky's the limit. All right, so let's get rid of this one. And what I want to do is, I want to apply my design to my piece of masonite, or in this case, MDF. And I'm just going to take the glue stick, and I'm just going to glue the back, and just apply it to the edges, because you want it to sit really nicely. Okay, once you got all the glue stick applied, just set it on, smooth it out, and it's ready for the next step. The next step is I would use my drill and drill a hole through it and pierce it out. Now, I'm not going to make you watch me do that. Ta-da! I've magically already cut one, and I saved the piece that I cut out from the center. And I want you to take a little look at this. I've curved the edges. I've almost turned it into a cabochon, if you will. And I've reduced the size of the piece just a little bit. So if I stick it back in, you'll notice there's room around it. And that's important because you need to leave room for the metal to occupy space and not just the piece of board to occupy space. All right, so this is going to actually become a tool. But before I use these tools, let's talk about the copper sheet metal. Now, the copper, like I said, works best if it's a little bit thinner. I think 24 gauge works best. And if you notice, there's some texture on this piece, and it's so much fun to work with highly textured material. I love these little bumps that stick out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a nice, flexible striking surface. In this case, I have the phone book. But before I get started, I'm going to put on my safety glasses because I am going to be working with a hammer. And whenever you're working with a hammer or any other tool, just be careful. You got to protect your eyes. Okay, so we're going to put this piece of 24 gauge copper on top. Remember, 24 gauge is kind of thin and it works really well. And this has been pre-annealed, brass brushed and dried, and it's beautiful. And now what I can do is I can just use the ball-peen hammer and just start to strike it. And you can do whatever pattern you want on here. Here, I'm just going to put a random line on it so you can see what happens to it. Okay. So now I have a row of little pimples on this. So now I can take this and turn it into half of my piece if I want to. All I need to do is, remembering that this is the outward side, put this face down and put the striking tool on top of it. But before you do that, just make sure that you're actually seeing the design through the opening where you want it. And that looks pretty good to me. So then just bring it back and hold this down, but don't hit your fingers. Watch where you're hitting and just strike it. Okay, see how it buckled up? Just hit it. Tell the copper you're boss and just shove it right back down. All right, so I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to hit the other side. You can already see that I've started to make an impression, and if I turn it over, it's already bulging out. But it looks a little bit flat because the tool has a bit of an edge to it. See, the tool fits right back in there perfectly, but we don't want that type of an edge. We want this to be a little bit more curvaceous. So I'll put this back into the mold. I'm going to give it a couple more strikes with the tool now that I have it centered. Okay, I'm going to hit the edges. Okay, now what I can do is I can come back with the rounded or the ball-peen end of the hammer, and I can just start to tap in the middle. Now sometimes this will add more texture, but that, in my opinion, that's great. If you don't like it, you could use a dapping punch and you could just kind of burnish the interior of this. Or maybe even a rounded hammer if you have one. Okay, I've added a lot of texture and now it looks really bumpy and cool and it's more of a curve. But before you go any further, what you want to do is put it back into the mold or the die and take the hammer and work the edges a bit. Okay, so now my edges are clearly defined. So I've made one half of it. Now, all I would need to do is make another half, and then I could shear around these pieces and sweat solder them together. And we have a video on sweat soldering. I've gone ahead and made a few extras, and I've used pre-textured metal. Here I've made designs that are a little bit more dynamic and interesting. And in this case, rather than using the ball-peen hammer, I did burnish with a larger dapping punch to get a nice smooth area. So I could just make this the other half of the piece and put them together through sweat soldering techniques. But remember, if you're going to sweat solder these together, there needs to be at least one hole or more to equalize pressure so that the thing doesn't blow up. You don't want an obituary written in your name that said, "She died doing what she loved most, working at the bench," incorrectly. So you can see here, if I take the flowers out, there's a large hole that allowed everything to equalize in terms of pressure, keeping me safe. And what's kind of cool too is the way that I finished it out was I tumbled it. We have a video on that. And I gave it a peanut oil patina, a rather dark one. And there's a video on that too. Yours doesn't have to be as dark as mine, but I think it's really, really pretty. But just make sure that your welds are tight because you need it to be able to hold water. Yeah, it was sitting there the whole time with water in it. I hope you enjoyed making these hollow die-formed pieces. Check out our other videos on the onlinejewelryacademy.com. You can subscribe right now to our channel, and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget fan funding. Thanks for watching.